This is why you need to prime your paper before you paint on it with oils. There's a big linseed oil stain around these paint samples, and aside from having this unattractive yellow stain around the edges of your painting, it's a problem in the long run because the linseed oil will start to break down the fibers of the paper and it can become brittle. These top two samples don't have that problem because I primed the paper before I put the paint down. The top sample has 2 coats of matte medium followed by a final coat of gesso, and then this bottom sample has 3 coats of gesso. And neither of them have the oil stain showing through around the back of the paper, and there's none showing through on the front of the paper. So it protects the paper from the linseed oil. Another thing you'll notice too is that since the paper is like a sponge and it soaks up a lot of the oil from the paint, if you look at the black sample at the top, it's a little bit more glossy than the black sample at the bottom. And that's because there's less linseed oil in there. I'm not sure if that would actually be a problem and cause the paint to be underbound, but I do think it makes it a little bit weaker. I mean, that only makes sense. There's less binder in there, so it won't be as strong as if it had all that oil in the paint. The simplest solution is just to buy some paper that's made for oil painting. This is Canson's oil and acrylic paper, and that's pretty convenient because you could use it for either medium. The texture is similar to linen. If you don't like the texture, that's okay. You can find some other art paper and prepare it yourself. Here's the same test done on the oil painting paper from Canson. I don't see any yellow stains around the outside, and if you turn it around to the back, there's no evidence that oil is seeping through the back either. So this works pretty well. This is a good solution if you just want to begin painting with oils without having to do any preparation. You just rip a sheet out of the pad and you begin painting. It's very convenient. Strathmore makes oil painting paper too. I just have the acrylic painting paper. You can use this for oil painting as long as you prime it first with gesso, and I show you how to do that later in the video. Here's what the texture looks like. It looks a little bit different than the Canson paper. Maybe it's a little bit more subtle. You'll have to try them out to see which one you like the best. As for the thickness of the paper that you decide to use for oil painting, you don't want to use super thin drawing paper because it won't hold up to oil painting. Gessobord is the thinnest paper I ever used, and it works okay. This is the Gessobord from Strathmore. It's 100 pounds, and it does work. I just think maybe 140 pound like watercolor paper might be a little bit more rigid for oil painting. Watercolor paper is also a good choice for painting with oils. I have some hot pressed watercolor paper from Fabriano. This is Fabriano Artistico, and the hot pressed surface is pretty smooth. So if you like a smooth surface, hot pressed watercolor paper is the way to go. Aside from hot pressed watercolor paper, you can get cold pressed, which has a subtle texture to it. And if you really like a lot of texture in your paintings, you can look for a rough watercolor paper. Each brand has a little bit of variation in what these textures look like, so you'll have to just try them out and see what you like. Later on, I demonstrate how I prepare hot pressed watercolor paper with matte medium and gesso. The thickness of your painting style is another thing you have to take into consideration. If you like to use thick impasto like palette knife marks in your paintings, you might want to reconsider using paper because oil paint dries over the course of months and even years, and it becomes more brittle with age. Since paper is flexible, that can actually encourage cracking over time. I mean, it can flex in this direction, but it also expands and contracts with the changes in the humidity in your environment. So I believe that canvas is a better support for impasto painting, and I think wood panels are even better. The wood panels that I recommend are from Ampersand. They make Gessobords. Gessobords are available in the 1/8 inch thickness, and they also have a cradled version which have wood strips around the outside on the back to give it more stability. And those are an excellent choice for impasto painting. They have a wide variety of sizes to choose from, and there's other types of panels too, such as Claybord and encaustic panels. You'll just have to take a look at them and try them out. Here's a test sample where you can see a little bit of an oil stain around the backside edge of a painting. I think what happens is sometimes the paint gets caught on the edge of the paper itself and the oil bleeds onto the back. Even if you're careful, I do think that the oil can get around to the back because I noticed when I lay down these test samples, I noticed that there's a little bit of oil seeping out around the edges of these paint samples, like beyond the paint boundaries itself. And I think what happens when you paint to the edge of a piece of paper, that oil can seep around to the back. It's not really a huge issue. I mean, it's just the edge. Maybe, decades later, that might become brittle. But the way that you can solve that problem is you prime the whole sheet of paper and then you tape off the edge with masking tape. That way, when you peel off the tape, you'll have a nice clean hard edged, but it will also leave like a 1/2 inch boundary around your entire painting. So if the oil seeps out beyond the edges of the painting, it's on the protected surface of the paper. It's a minor detail, but it's something to consider. It only takes a little bit of time to mask off the edges and it'll protect the paper better. If you have some other type of paper in mind other than oil painting paper, how do you prepare it? Well, there's 2 different ways you can do it. One is you just apply a couple of coats of gesso, let it dry, and then you can paint on it. I demonstrate that with the Strathmore acrylic paper, just to show that you can use acrylic paper for oil painting. And then I do another method where I apply 2 coats of acrylic matte medium, and then for a final coat, I put gesso over the top of it. And that's just so that it's easier to draw on top of gesso than it is on like a matte medium. And I'll demonstrate how to do that next. In this demo, I put the first coat on there while it's still in the pad, but I find it's a little bit easier if you remove it from the pad. The other thing that's nice about using acrylic paper is that since it's made for acrylics, you don't have to like tape it down, because even if it does warp a little bit as you put it on there, it will dry flat. They do put some sort of sizing on here to help prevent water from being absorbed by the paper. Priming paper with gesso is pretty straightforward. You just want to like shake up the gesso so that everything's combined and stirred together. Squirt some out onto the paper and just brush it on with a regular like nylon brush that's made for acrylics. So here's some acrylic gesso, and I'll just give it a coat. So you just brush it on and you work it into the texture of the paper. It can be a little tricky to tell like what parts you've coated before because you're putting white paint on white paper. But the trick that I have is you could just sort of hold it up to the light at an angle and you can see the wet area better that way because it reflects the light. Once you have one coat on there, you can let it dry. I usually use a hairdryer because I'm impatient. So I use a hairdryer, and then you don't want to like apply a second coat while it's still tacky. Let it dry and then put a second coat on. I'm going to tear this out of the pad so that it's easier to put another coat on it. Now it's time for the second coat. I know I didn't get along the edge so well because it was still in the pad. I recommend at least 2 coats because sometimes you might miss a spot. So the second time you put a coat on there, it'll probably fill those areas in. It's really important that you get a good coat of gesso on there, because I've noticed like when I was a student and I stretched my own canvas, I would apply like 2 coats of gesso to it and I would paint something on it, and then 6 months later I would notice there's like oil stains on the back of the canvas. And what that means is there were some parts of that canvas that didn't get filled in with the gesso, and the oil was allowed to seep through to the back of the canvas. Now having 2 coats on there and having it seep through, there's some protection, but you really want to have it so that no oil seeps through to the back of the paper or the back of the canvas. I recommend at least 2 coats for that reason. I do 3 thin coats. I like applying it in a thin manner because it dries faster, and then it also allows the texture of the paper to show through in the final painting. If you do heavy coats, you get brush marks in your gesso. You might like that, but this is what I prefer, so I do 3 coats. Watercolor paper is a little different. I have this block of watercolor paper, and the cool thing is it's bound on all 4 edges. So even if it does warp when I put gesso on there, it will dry flat because it's kind of like stretched watercolor paper. In this demo, I use 2 coats of matte medium followed by a coat of gesso. And I think matte medium, since it's 100% acrylic emulsion, I believe that provides a little bit better of a barrier between the oil paint and the paper. Gesso is designed to be a little bit absorbent. I think if you have 2 coats of it on paper, that'll prevent the oil from penetrating the paper, but I just thought I would demonstrate how you can do this with matte medium. This is fluid matte medium from Liquitex. There are other brands that make matte medium. It's very similar to applying the gesso. You just squeeze some out on there and brush it on. That feels dry to the touch, so I'll go ahead and put the second coat on. I dried the second coat with a hairdryer, and now I'll add the final coat of gesso. I also show you how I use masking tape to mask off the border so that you have a nice border around the outside with sharp edges. And it also prevents the oil paint from bleeding around to the back edge of the paper like I talked about previously. I've decided to split this up into 2 different paintings, each one being 8 by 10. If your masking tape is too aggressive, sometimes you can wear it out by applying it to a surface repeatedly, or maybe even your clothing to pick up some lint. Otherwise, you might rip the paper when you remove it. I hope that helps you to get started with painting with oils and paper. Up next is an oil painting demonstration.